For over 2 million years, our ancestors shaped stone. They cracked river cobbles against harder rocks, peeled away flakes with the patience of sculptors, and produced edges sharper than anything nature had provided. These were tools: scrapers for hides, choppers for bone, blades for carving meat from a carcass. But somewhere in the deep silence of the Paleolithic, that same ingenuity turned inward. The hands that had learned to feed us learned to kill us. And the weapons they created were not crude. They were not clumsy. They were devastatingly precisely engineered, and 7 of them reshaped what it meant to be human. To understand what our ancestors fought with, we must first understand what they fought over. The popular imagination often portrays prehistoric life as a solitary struggle against saber-toothed cats and woolly mammoths, a daily battle for survival against the wild. But the archaeological record tells a different story. Either the most persistent threat to a Paleolithic human was not a predator, it was another human. For 97% of our history as a species, we lived in small, mobile bands of 20 to 50 individuals, moving through landscapes that were shared, contested, and defended. Competition for territory, for access to water sources during dry seasons, for mates, for the migration routes of game herds. These pressures existed long before the first city wall was ever raised. And when those pressures exceeded what negotiation or avoidance could resolve, violence followed. Not the organized violence of armies and generals, but something rawer. Raids at dawn, ambushes along river crossings, sudden confrontations at territorial boundaries that escalated from shouting to killing in minutes. The evidence is written in bone. Skulls recovered from sites across Europe, Africa, and the Near East show fracture patterns consistent with interpersonal violence, depressed cranial wounds, healed facial injuries, embedded projectile points lodged between ribs. At Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, a cemetery dating to approximately 13,000 years ago contained the remains of at least 61 individuals. Nearly half showed signs of violent death. Flint points were found embedded in their bones, in spines, in pelvises, in rib cages. One individual had been struck by over 20 separate projectiles. These were not accidents. These were not isolated disputes. These were systematic, lethal engagements between groups. And here is the paradox that runs through the entire Paleolithic. The same cognitive abilities that allowed us to cooperate, to plan, to share information across generations. These were also the abilities that made us the most dangerous predators our own species would ever face. The mind that could anticipate a herd's migration route could also anticipate an enemy's movements. The hand that could shape stone into a scraper could shape it into a killing edge. The weapons that made this violence possible evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, each one building on the last, each one extending the reach, the force, and the lethality of the human body. What follows is the story of 7 of them, not as a catalog, but as a chain. Because every weapon here created the conditions for the next. The wooden spear was the first, and for a long time, it was enough. In 1995, archaeologists working in an open-pit coal mine near Schöningen, Germany, uncovered something that rewrote the timeline of human warfare. Preserved in waterlogged peat, alongside the butchered remains of wild horses, lay a set of wooden spears. They were not sharpened sticks. They were carefully shaped from spruce trunks. At each one between 1.8 and 2.3 meters long, with the center of gravity placed in the forward third. Exactly where a modern javelin balances. The tips had been hardened by fire. They were approximately 300,000 years old. This was not the work of Homo sapiens. These spears were made by Homo heidelbergensis, a species that preceded us, and they demonstrate a level of planning and craftsmanship that challenges every assumption about primitive minds. The Schöningen spears were designed for throwing, if they could kill at distance. For the first time in the archaeological record, we see a weapon that allowed the user to strike without being struck, and that single innovation changed everything. Distance meant safety. Safety meant strategy. Strategy meant coordination. The wooden spear turned hunting from an act of individual courage into a group operation. A line of throwers could drive prey into a bottleneck, strike from multiple angles, overwhelm an animal that no single hunter could have taken alone. And what worked against horses worked against other humans. The spear was not invented for war, but war found a use for it almost immediately. and it would remain the dominant weapon on Earth for longer than any other. The hand axe was never meant to be a weapon. It became one anyway. The Acheulean hand axe is the longest surviving tool design in human history. And first appearing roughly 1.7 million years ago in East Africa and persisting for over 1 million years with remarkably little variation, it is a teardrop-shaped piece of flaked stone, sharpened on both faces, designed to fit in the palm. It could chop wood, butcher game, dig roots, scrape hides. It was the Swiss Army knife of the Pleistocene, but a hand axe is also a weapon of devastating close-range effectiveness. Its weight, typically 500 grams to over a kilogram, combined with its sharp bifacial edge makes it capable of delivering crushing, cutting blows simultaneously. Archaeological evidence from sites like Cima de los Huesos in Spain, where a cache of Acheulean tools was found alongside the remains of at least 28 individuals dating to 430,000 years ago, suggests these implements were intimately connected to both life and death. A single overhead strike with a hand axe to an unprotected skull would have been fatal, no follow-up required. What makes the hand axe significant is not its sophistication, but its ubiquity. For over 1 million years, across 3 continents, this was the dominant technology. Every adult member of an early human group likely possessed one. It was always within reach, tucked into a hide wrap, carried in the hand during travel, left beside the sleeping place at night. Violence with a hand axe was not premeditated warfare. It was immediate, personal, and available to anyone at any moment. There was no escalation ladder, no time to reconsider. The distance between argument and fatality was measured in seconds. The stone-tipped spear marked a fundamental shift. For the first time, we combined materials. In around 500,000 years ago, and with increasing frequency by 300,000 years ago, humans began to attach sharpened stone points to wooden shafts using a combination of plant resin, sinew binding, and precise notching. This technology, known as hafting, was not a minor improvement. It was a revolution in engineering logic. The wooden spear was a single material shaped into a weapon. The stone-tipped spear was a composite, 2 materials with different properties combined to produce something neither could achieve alone. Wood provided the reach and the momentum. Stone provided the cutting edge. The consequence was staggering. A stone-tipped spear could penetrate hide and muscle far more deeply than a fire-hardened wooden point. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that hafted stone points increase penetration depth by 20 to 30% compared to sharpened wood alone, while also creating wider wound channels that cause faster blood loss. The prey bled out more quickly, the enemy fell more reliably, and because stone points could be napped to a razor edge, particularly from high-quality materials like obsidian and fine-grained flint, the wounds they inflicted were catastrophically difficult to survive without modern medicine. At the South African site of Cavemen, researchers identified stone points dating to approximately 500,000 years ago that show impact fractures consistent with use as spear tips, making them among the earliest evidence of composite weapon technology on Earth. The stone-tipped spear was not just deadlier, it was the proof that our ancestors could think in abstractions, imagining how separate components could be joined to create something greater than the sum of their parts. The club requires no explanation and deserves more respect than it receives. Of all the weapons in this sequence, the club is the most overlooked and the most universal. It appears in every inhabited continent, in every era, in every culture that left a trace. A heavy piece of wood, sometimes reinforced with a stone head lashed to the end, the club is the simplest force multiplier ever conceived. It extends the arm, it concentrates energy into a smaller impact area. It breaks bones. The physics are blunt but effective. A human fist delivers roughly 50 to 150 joules of kinetic energy on impact. A wooden club of 1 to 2 kilograms, swung in a full arc, delivers 300 to 500 joules, concentrated on a contact area a fraction the size of a fist. Against an unprotected skull, the result is not a bruise. It is a structural collapse. The bone fragments inward, compressing brain tissue, causing hemorrhage, unconsciousness, and frequently death. Against long bones, forearms, or tibias, a single blow can produce a complete fracture. The archaeological evidence for clubs is inherently sparse, wood decays, and a club is often indistinguishable from any other piece of timber once the binding rots away. But the evidence for club use is abundant in the skeletons themselves, and depressed cranial fractures, circular or oval depressions in the skull caused by a concentrated blow from a rounded object, are among the most common indicators of interpersonal violence in prehistoric remains. These injuries appear with startling frequency. At Uhlau in Germany, a 4,600-year-old burial site revealed a family group killed together: a man, a woman, and 2 children. The adults showed multiple blunt force injuries to the skull and forearms. The forearm fractures are what forensic scientists call defense wounds, injuries sustained while raising the arms to block an incoming strike. The positioning of the bodies suggested they had been buried by someone who knew them, who arranged them facing each other, hands interlinked, violence and tenderness separated by hours. The club was the weapon of raids, fast, silent, requiring no preparation and no specialized material. Anyone could pick up a branch. Not everyone walked away. To the atlatl, the spear thrower, broke the final limitation of the human arm. Around 40,000 to 30,000 years ago, a deceptively simple device appeared in the archaeological record: a flat or hooked stick, roughly half a meter long, designed to cradle the butt end of a light spear or dart. By extending the effective length of the throwing arm, the atlatl acts as a lever, dramatically increasing the velocity and range of the projectile. A hand-thrown spear might travel 30 meters with meaningful force. An atlatl-launched dart can reach 70 meters or more, arriving with enough kinetic energy to penetrate large game or a human torso at distances that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. The physics are elegant. The atlatl increases the angular velocity of the throw by adding a secondary pivot point behind the hand. The result is a launch speed estimated at 90 to 150 kilometers per hour, indeed depending on the thrower's skill and the weight of the dart. Bone and antler atlatl hooks have been recovered from Upper Paleolithic sites across Europe, often elaborately carved, some in the shape of animals, others decorated with geometric patterns. These were not disposable tools. They were valued, personal, refined over lifetimes. The atlatl's military significance was profound. It turned open ground into a killing field, where an approaching enemy could be struck at range, repeatedly, before reaching close combat distance. Defensive positions became viable, ambush tactics became lethal, and for the first time, a physically smaller individual armed with an atlatl could outmatch a larger opponent armed with a thrusting spear. The atlatl democratized lethal force. Strength mattered less. Skill mattered more. The bow and arrow did not merely improve on the atlatl, it replaced it entirely. The earliest definitive evidence for bow and arrow technology comes from Sibudu Cave in South Africa, where tiny stone points, too small and too light to function as spear tips, were found with residues of plant adhesive and traces of impact damage. They date to approximately 64,000 years ago. In Europe, the technology became widespread by around 20,000 years ago, and by the Mesolithic period, the bow had become the dominant projectile weapon across virtually every habitable region on Earth. The advantages were transformative. A bow stores energy mechanically. The drawn string holds the archer's effort as potential energy, releasing it instantaneously. This means the archer can aim without trembling from exertion, adjust for wind and distance, and fire with precision at targets 40 to 60 meters away with lethal accuracy. Rate of fire was equally revolutionary. An experienced atlatl user might launch a dart every 10 to 15 seconds. A skilled archer could loose an arrow every 3 to 5 seconds. In a confrontation between two groups of equal size, the one armed with bows would deliver 3 to 5 times the volume of projectiles in the same window. The mathematics of violence shifted permanently. But the bow's most consequential feature was stealth. An atlatl requires a full-body throwing motion, visible, loud, exposed. An archer can crouch behind cover, draw silently, and release with minimal movement. Ambush, assassination, all raiding under cover of darkness. The bow made all of these not just possible, but tactically optimal. At Crow Creek in South Dakota, the remains of nearly 500 individuals, men, women, and children, were found in a mass grave dating to the 14th century. The majority showed evidence of arrow wounds. Entire communities could be destroyed before they understood what was happening. The obsidian blade was the last and the sharpest. It was also, in many ways, the most human. Obsidian is volcanic glass, formed when lava cools so rapidly that its molecules have no time to organize into a crystalline structure. The result is a material that, when fractured correctly, produces an edge measured in nanometers, literally sharper than a modern surgical scalpel. Under an electron microscope, a steel scalpel blade looks jagged and rough, a serrated landscape of peaks and valleys. An obsidian edge looks like a clean geometric line. It parts tissue at the cellular level. Prehistoric knappers understood this. They could not see it under magnification, but they could feel it. The way an obsidian flake sliced through hide with almost no resistance. The way it separated sinew as though the material were offering no objection. At Obsidian Cliff, in what is now Yellowstone National Park, massive quarrying operations extracted raw obsidian that was traded across thousands of kilometers. In Anatolia, the obsidian sources around Çatalhöyük fueled a trade network that stretched from the Levant to the Zagros Mountains by 7000 BC. The material was so valued that communities built permanent settlements near volcanic outcrops, specifically to control its extraction and distribution. Obsidian was currency before currency existed. Old blades and daggers recovered from Neolithic and Chalcolithic sites are often exquisitely thin, some less than a millimeter at the cutting edge, and several show use wear patterns consistent with cutting soft tissue. At Çatalhöyük itself, obsidian blades were found placed deliberately alongside burials, tucked beneath plastered floors where the dead were interred under the houses of the living. The killing power of an obsidian blade was unlike anything else in the prehistoric arsenal. It did not crush or bludgeon, it severed. A deep cut from an obsidian edge would have caused rapid, massive blood loss. And unlike a wound from a blunt weapon, the clean incision would have been nearly impossible to staunch with the materials available. The wound would not swell shut. It would simply keep bleeding. In close combat, an obsidian dagger was not a weapon of brute force. It was a weapon of surgical precision, and in the hands of someone who knew where to strike, it was as lethal as any arrow. These 7 weapons span nearly 500,000 years of human ingenuity. From a fire-hardened stick balanced for throwing to a glass blade sharper than modern steel, each one represents a solution to the same fundamental problem: how to project force beyond the reach of the human body. And each solution created a new problem. The wooden spear demanded the stone tip. The stone tip demanded the atlatl demanded the bow demanded armor, fortification, walls, and eventually, the organized violence we call war. There is a pattern here that extends far beyond the Paleolithic. Every weapon in this chain increased the distance between the killer and the killed. The hand axe required you to stand close enough to see the face of the person you struck. The atlatl allowed you to kill from across a clearing. The bow allowed you to kill from behind a ridge, unseen, unheard. And each step widened the gap between action and consequence. And that gap would only grow. Bronze swords, iron cavalry, gunpowder, artillery, missiles launched from continents away. The trajectory was set in stone, quite literally. 300,000 years ago in a German peat bog. We often speak of human progress as a story of cooperation, of language, of art painted on cave walls by firelight. And it is all of those things. But it is also this. In every leap in our social complexity was shadowed by a leap in our capacity for destruction. The same mind that imagined a composite spear also imagined using it against a neighbor. The same hand that carved an atlatl hook in the shape of a deer also launched the dart that ended a life. The same communities that shared food around a fire also planned raids against the camp across the valley. The weapons changed. The hands that held them did not. And the stone, the wood, the volcanic glass, they remember nothing. But the bones do. Thousands of years later, the fractures are still legible. The embedded points still lodged where they landed. The evidence is patient, and it tells a story we would prefer to forget. That we